that was, in a sense, a turning point for everyone, that, people assemble outside a police station in a demonstration unarmed, and 69 of them, majority shot in the back, meaning that they were actually fleeing from the scene. Of course, that creates a great deal of anger. And I think for many people, that was it. And people said, well, if that's going to be the response, we've got to have to find other means of taking care of this situation.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks.
Following the Sharpeville massacre, the African National Congress was banned, and 2 years later, its leader, Nelson Mandela, was imprisoned. At his trial, he announced that the events of 1960 had compelled the ANC to commit itself to armed struggle. Violence, said Mandela, was inevitable in this country. The architects of apartheid turned his prophecy into a reality.
Increasingly, they began to kill people. I think it was just deliberate murder of people. It was not a mistake. There was hardly a family in the urban areas and townships and later in the rural areas that had not been affected by detentions, by torture. So it was just about every family in the townships was affected by it.
In 1976, South Africa's black school children protested against a new law stipulating that classes be taught in Afrikaans, a language most couldn't speak. 250,000 black people rioted in Soweto alone. Over 500 people were killed by the police during the Soweto uprising, including black consciousness leader Steve Biko. South Africa was engulfed in a firestorm of violence. Yet in the West, there were still many apologists for apartheid. But this isn't surprising. In the southern states of the USA, many features of apartheid, the disenfranchisement of black voters, laws against intermarriage and segregation, endured well after the Second World War. As in South Africa, racial violence remained commonplace. In 1946, African-American soldiers returning from the war were being lynched at a rate of 1 a week.
There are cases when black soldiers waiting at the train station, waiting their ride, were lynched because how dare they wear that uniform? They had died for the lyncher and his right to murder them. This was the paradox and indeed the vicious irony of the black participation in the Second World War and the fight for democracy on foreign shores, which drove them to fight even more vigorously back here at home.
Protests from prominent anti-racists, including Paul Robeson and Albert Einstein, prompted President Truman, himself a former member of the Ku Klux Klan, to appoint a committee that campaigned to end lynching. At last, government initiatives to counter racism began to trickle through. In 1955, the ruling in the Brown versus the Board of Education case found that the provision of separate but equal schools was unconstitutional, bringing segregation in the education system to an end. White supremacists mounted resistance to the move. At Little Rock, Arkansas, National Guardsmen protected black pupils who had to run a gauntlet of racist violence in order to attend school. By the mid-1950s, those who resisted racism were liable to suffer severe reprisals, as was shown by the experience of a 14-year-old from Mississippi, Emmett Till.
I'm Simeon Wright, the son of Mose Wright. I lived in Mississippi in 1955. Emmett Till and my cousin Wheeler came to visit us Wednesday. This is the fateful night that we went into Money, Mississippi. Went to this little town, little store, Bryant's Grocery. After we got outside, Mrs. Bryant came out behind us. And she was walking towards her car, and that's when Emmett whistled at her. And when he whistled, man, it scared us out of our wits because we knew that was a taboo, and we couldn't get to the car fast enough to get out of there. Then we got in the car, we came home. Emmett and I, we went to bed, and about, I would say, 2 a.m. in the morning, I heard this noise in the house. And I woke up, I saw two white men standing at the foot of the bed. And they marched Emmett out to the truck. So they took Emmett, and 3 days later, we found out they had killed him. He was thrown in the Tallahatchie River. My dad said it looked like they had hit him in the head with a hammer. He was shot behind the ear. It was just a horrible scene.
I believe that the whole United States is mourning with me. And if the death of my son can mean something to the other unfortunate people all over the world, then for him to have died a hero would mean more to me than for him just to have died.
Emmett's mother, she decided that she wanted the world to see what those men had done to her son. So they had a cassette, the top was glass, and you could see the body. You could see his mutilated body during the funeral procession. And the whole world were able to see what the Jim Crow laws and the people of Mississippi, the white people of Mississippi, were doing to blacks.
I never will forget it. I was 5 years old when I saw that picture. I was just stunned by the ferocity of hate that had produced the violence on this young man's body. And for Negro Americans, it strengthened our resolve that Jim Crow had to go.
Emmett Till's death was a catalyst. Less than 4 months after the murder, on December the 5th, 1951, Rosa Parks was arrested when she refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama. When Martin Luther King called for the Montgomery bus boycott, 99% of the black population took part, action which led to a Supreme Court ruling in 1956, which desegregated the buses. The civil rights movement was born. Civil rights protests met with violence, as happened when black people tried to eat at segregated lunch counters. Throughout the 1960s, protesters were wounded, imprisoned, and killed. The movement's most articulate spokesmen were eventually silenced. Dr. King and Malcolm X were to be murdered.
With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
Freedom comes to us either by ballots or by bullets. That's the only way freedom is gotten.
Although the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1968 prohibited discrimination, the majority of black people continued to live in substandard housing, go to poor schools, and experience a lifetime of poverty.
Well, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. saw the failure. He said it himself. He said, look, the first part of the movement, relatively speaking, was a piece of cake because it was easy for America. Civil rights bill doesn't cost much. Give people the right to vote doesn't cost much. But now what we're doing, the second part of the movement, the part about economic equality and social injustice, well, that's going to cost something. It's not about just letting us have access to the lunch counter. Martin Luther King Jr. said, what good is it to be able to go to a lunch counter but can't afford to buy a hamburger?
From 1964 to 67, there was fierce rioting in cities across the US as African